In the summer of 1874, in the opulent hills of Hampshire in southern England, a quiet revolution in evangelical Christianity began that would have a profound effect across the Atlantic in the United States. The instigators of this quiet revolution were themselves American, a power couple of American holiness teachings, Robert Piersall Smith and Hannah Whitall Smith. They were invited to the estate of William Cowper Temple, later 1st Baron Temple Mount, a wealthy Quaker and liberal politician with evangelical leanings. At his Broadlands Park estate, he had planned, with the help of like-minded Anglicans, a week-long gathering on what was being called the higher Christian life. The Smiths had, for a short moment, cornered the market on a certain popular formulation of what it meant to be a higher Christian. The Smiths taught of a divinely intended pairing of joy and piety that called for renewed Christian commitment, resembling what Hannah called the happy carelessness of childhood. Since 1872, the Smiths were touring Great Britain, appealing with a message blending Pennsylvania backwoods religious fervor and New York's burned-over district, shaped by anxious confessions and revivals. At Broadlands, these elements merged into a more refined setting. Their son recalled the gathering lacked the wild phenomena of American camp meetings, which my mother didn't support, and I don't remember aristocrats foaming or rolling in ecstasy on those Hampshire lawns. Broadlands aimed to appeal to Victorian sensibilities of a select 100 attendees, with meetings typically held beside the river under beech trees. Activities included reading scriptures, short addresses, prayer, acts of faith, silent waiting, and discussions on personal grace. Deeper talks took place in secluded woods, with participants praying alone, studying the Bible, and discussing their faith passionately with each other. This environment fostered lifelong commitments to this form of holiness. What was this holiness? The Smiths were in their 30s when they first read and then became devotees of William Boardman's The Higher Christian Life, the book whose title coined the higher life, 1858. Boardman, an Ohio Valley farmer turned pastor with interests in faith healing, positive thought, and more radical teachings, wrote his transatlantic bestseller to offer, in his words, knowledge as really reliable and true that there is actually a sunny side of the Christian life. He was distraught that much of the division in Christendom was over doctrines of salvation and sanctification. He countered that they all boiled down to a quest for a higher plane of existence, guided by the Holy Spirit. His summary was that the spiritual experience is the same, even if the theories are different. As enthusiasts of Boardman's basic message, Hannah and Robert were, in their eclectic religious influences, something of Boardman's ideal audience. The Smiths had parents from or had spent stints in Presbyterian, Quaker, Plymouth Brethren, and Methodist churches. Hannah, whose fame and influence was longer lasting than Robert's, has been called an orthodox heretic by one historian, and a rational mystic by another. The labels point to the core tension at the heart of her spirituality, which by the 1870s had spread rapidly and lacked a formal theological home. She taught that Christian living meant obtaining power through surrender and responding to a free gift, God's grace, through discipline. Happiness would follow. She delivered this message most effectively in her own international bestseller, The Christian Secret of a Happy Life, which would come out in 1875. In the UK, influenced by the Smiths, this teaching blended with British elements and became known as Keswick Holiness, named after the English resort town where an annual gathering was held based on teachings from figures like the Smiths. The message was spreading. In Paris, Switzerland, and Berlin, Robert spoke to thousands about the baptism with the Holy Spirit. Dwight Moody, a leading American revivalist, played a key role among converts to the Smiths' higher Christian life. His extensive network popularized higher life teachings across America and continues today. Moody met the Smiths in the UK during his own tour of Britain from 1873 to 1875, where he learned about the Smiths' teachings and met with them personally. The timing was fortunate. The teachings were not systematic, yet they contained some core themes. Robert said they started with renunciation of sin, both of evil and doubtful acts. Sin identification involved thorough confession of wickedness, both privately and publicly. This fostered dependence on God and the cross, inspiring a desire to be filled with the Spirit and to be crucified with Christ, so Christ could live in place of the old self, echoing Bible verses in Romans and Galatians. The Smiths' European tour, called a triumphant journey by one historian, didn't end in triumph. It ended in disaster. Anticipation was high for the June 1875 inaugural Keswick Convention, which would feature the Smiths. However, public allegations arose that Robert, during his European tour, had met a young American woman, a writer, in his locked room. Both Robert and the woman agreed that they held hands and kissed, but Robert claimed no sexual intent. He claimed he saw her more as a spiritual daughter. Yet this claim only deepened suspicion. Rumors spread that he promoted a controversial holy kisses doctrine, encouraging physical kisses among Christians as a sign of spiritual power, a practice warned against by leading American Christians such as Jonathan Edwards over a century earlier. The Smiths' teachings soon came under scrutiny, and a later comment from Robert's son noted the extravagant secret doctrine was prevalent in America, with the close proximity of spiritual and amorous feelings potentially leading to lust. An impromptu tribunal by evangelical ministers connected to Keswick in Britain judged Robert's conduct unbecoming, ending his public ministry in 1875. He returned to the U.S. humiliated and soon disowned his own teachings. Within a couple of years, Hannah also rejected her teachings, returning to the Quaker fold and embracing Christian universalism, and even a more spiritualist-inflected Protestantism. She befriended poet Walt Whitman and psychologist William James. Robert's fall from grace and Hannah's departure from the higher life in 1875 ironically helped their ideas maintain influence internationally. By that year, Dwight Moody and his extensive network of schools, magazines, revival tours, and supportive churches and conferences had become the main channels for the higher life's popularity in the U.S. The swift separation of the popular higher life teachings from its original, soon defamed promoters made its ideas spread rapidly across British and American circles without the reputational baggage of the Smiths. The couple's quick rise and subsequent fall sparked widespread interest in higher life teachings. The impact was lasting, as it displaced previous beliefs for many Christians who came from more doctrinaire Calvinist or Wesleyan backgrounds, and it paved the way for new growth. Around Moody, the next generation of leaders emerged, people like Reuben Torrey and Albert Simpson. These leaders built Bible schools, denominations, missions organizations, and print empires that became the backbone of modern evangelical culture. The higher life also included fundamentalists like William Bell Riley and John R. Rice, as well as influential figures like Bill Bright, Billy Graham, and Jerry Falwell. Sarah Young's Jesus Calling, a devotional that is also the best-selling nonfiction book in the 21st century, with more than 40 million copies sold, acknowledges Keswick influences in its foreword. The teachings of the higher life popularized by the Smiths have played a crucial role in shaping Pentecostal, fundamentalist, evangelical, and charismatic religious movements. Its origins in the 1970s are an ocean and a world away.
Welcome to American Evangelicals, a history podcast, where we explore the complex, often surprising story of evangelicalism in America. In our last episode, we focused on conversion, the new birth, as a defining feature of evangelical identity. But today, we're asking a different question. What happens after that moment? What does it actually look like to live the Christian life? To get at that, we turn to a fascinating 19th century story, the rise of the Smiths, a husband and wife duo who become transatlantic religious celebrities. Along the way, we'll explore big themes like the Anglo-American roots of evangelicalism, the blurred lines between theology and experience, the role of gender, and even the ever-present reality of scandal. This is a story about spirituality, power, and what it really means to pursue holiness, and it might reshape how you think about evangelicalism altogether. Let's get into the conversation.
So Dan, tell us, why did you choose this story for getting our podcast going?
So there's a couple answers to that. A really sort of mundane one is I'm working on a book right now, and the Smiths play a role in that book. And so I'm familiar with their story, particularly the part we're talking about here, how they become sort of celebrities for a moment in time. But to get to the theme of these first few episodes and trying to get at something about the definition of evangelicalism, I think there's a few themes that this story pulls out that add on to what we talked about in our first episode around really focusing in on conversion. One is just the way that this story about the Smiths is very Anglo-American. It takes place somewhat in Britain. It involves Americans. Last time we talked about Whitefield, who was in the colonies back in the 18th century. Here we have Americans sort of being celebrities in the UK in the 19th century. So there's something deeper there going on that is just a theme throughout studying American evangelicalism about the connection to Britain and then to the broader European context. I also think this story has a lot of interesting angles into it about the role of men and women. In evangelicalism, it's notable that Hannah is a woman who is teaching, not necessarily from pulpits, and we can get into the real nuances of that, but she's teaching mixed audiences about the truths of the religion. So I thought there was an interesting angle into there, and how spiritual power manifests differently for men and women, and is also sort of bound up in scandal and other things. And then lastly, I was thinking about, it's a fuzzy category, spirituality or spiritual practices, but I've come to think that that's a really important part of what distinguishes evangelicals from other Christians. The ways they understand what it means to be holy, to use a theological term, what it means to be sanctified or to be on the process of becoming sanctified, and sort of how does that happen within the boundaries of the way evangelicals do church and prioritize the Bible and other things. And so if, this is one of the things I think might get a little short shrift in the Bebington quadrilateral that we talked about last time, where, conversionism is a really important part. That's sort of how you become a member of the tribe of evangelicals. And then we have activism, which is often focusing on sort of these outward acts that evangelicals do, whether that's social service or missions. But there's this whole other sort of area of evangelical experience, which is more about the individual. What are you called to do as an evangelical, to be a good Christian, to put it maybe crudely? And the Keswick movement, the higher life movement are all sort of trying to address those questions. And I thought that would be an interesting thing to put into the mix when we're talking about what we mean by American evangelicals.
So in some ways, if our last episode was about the kind of conversion, the new birth, this is about what happens after the new birth. And that's just as important to evangelical identity, right? You're arguing, and I think you're right, than just the new birth. And then, I think down the road, Maggie's going to talk about doctrine too, right? As an important thing. But to start with the Anglo-American connections, I mean, I think it's really interesting that even though our story last time about George Whitefield in the first episode, was in Connecticut, but, Whitefield was a transatlantic figure. There's a transatlantic dimension here. Interestingly enough, the entire kind of Bebington quadrilateral is written by, the Bebington's book was in the context of British evangelicalism. So, I know that there have been others who have written about the British transatlantic context, right? So it's interesting that so far we're stressing this.
I think too, the 19th century is really the time to focus on that transatlantic connection. So much that happens at the end of the 19th and early 20th century does kind of divide evangelicals in an American sense that separates them somewhat from the British experience. And I think that if you go into anything with the 19th century, it's very much so a web that is much broader than just America. You see that, I think, demonstrated really well in your story of the Smiths. And another thing, too, that I think is a really key component, that is something that we emphasized a little bit last time, that's gotten even more complicated since the First Great Awakening, is the denominational mix. That you have all of these different denominations that are involved, and that evangelicalism has now kind of become a really self-aware pan-evangelical movement that's transcending denominations, but in really careful ways. And I think the Smiths can help illustrate that as well. And that the holiness movement in particular, this kind of emphasis on living practice rather than theology, kind of facilitated that trans-denominational impact.
And I think one way to, when we talk about something like spirituality or holiness, we can start leaving the historical context behind. It feels a little like it's out of time and place. But really part of the interesting part of this story is that we're hitting evangelicals, Anglo-American evangelicals, at a certain moment, the 1870s, when there is a massive sea change. We mentioned this last episode for a minute, maybe a couple times we mentioned it offhand, that we have a growth of a different type of way of thinking about the Christian life, which comes out of the holiness movement, which is deeply influenced by John and Charles Wesley and the Methodist movement, which is very different than, in some key ways, from the more Calvinist Puritan tradition that Whitefield was a part of, or at least expressing parts of it. And so in the 1870s, the Wesleyan holiness tradition is the dominant tradition. And you see that in the stories of the Smiths, the role of Quakerism and other sort of radical Protestants in the holiness movement. And so there's a particular way there's a reason why that way of thinking about being a Christian is popular in an era where there's in the American side, a lot of popular democracy talk. There's this idea of a strong sense of individualism. And there's an idea that there's actually things individuals can do to sort of better their circumstances in all areas of life, including their spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
And the Wesleyan way of thinking about spirituality, one term that comes a lot in the Smiths and in people like them is empowerment by the Spirit, or the endowment of the Spirit. The sense that the Holy Spirit is not just something, it's not just, to use some theological language, it's not just a forensic thing. It's not just something that sort of in legal terms, okay, now you're a Christian. It's that you've actually been given power by God to actually better yourself and better the world around you. And that comes out of this holiness movement in a very strong way. Starts really with the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, but then just sort of builds momentum throughout the 19th century. So when we get to people like the Smiths, they grew up in a culture that was really about how Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, was a way to empower yourself in society. And some people still today would portray Christianity that way. But back then, that was a more novel way that was hitting an American culture that was industrializing, that was sort of spreading across the continental United States, in a national sense, was turning pretty quickly to foreign wars by the end of the 19th century. And this type of spirituality was sort of in that mix as well, and in some cases justifying those types of moves in a collective sense.
The historiography on this is really, really interesting. I know, Dan, we've talked about this before, off the podcast. You have Nathan Hatch's democratization, which is all about this challenge to the Calvinist understanding, right? This individualism, which kind of maps nicely on the holiness stuff. It's not the Calvinist stuff. But then when you get after the Civil War, much of the, at least till recently, the prevailing historiography, and, let's name some names here, people like Mark Knoll and George Marsden and these people, it was really, the story was really traced through a Reformed lens. So when they're writing about the late 19th century, Marsden's writing about Keswick in fundamentalism in American culture, but the real through line is Princeton Theological Seminary, right? This Calvinist bastion of Calvinism. B.B. Warfield, Charles Briggs in the battle for the Presbyterian Church, J. Gresham Machen. And then even through post-World War II, it's very Calvinist, right? And, back in the day, there was this challenge to that historiography, which really didn't gain a lot of ground. I think it was largely because the man making it, Donald Dayton, and others did not have kind of my take at least, let's just put it crudely, he didn't have the financial resources. He wasn't getting tons of pew money to advance the more Wesleyan holiness, stuff that you're talking about. I see your work, Dan, and I think you agree, as almost the sort of phase two of the, what if we give Dayton another shot here? And he was onto something, right? In a way that Knoll and Marsden and the Reformed historiography of evangelicalism never quite embraced or accepted. Fair way to put it is to make it central to the story of what evangelicalism is.
And there's some newer historians that I think maybe to get beyond the debate on is the sort of soul of American evangelicalism Calvinist or Wesleyan, it's sort of showing how it's both and neither at the same time. There's a real, and that's part of what makes evangelical interesting, also confusing, is there's no clearinghouse for this stuff. It's just sort of worked out with different prominent figures and institutions. So I think of someone like Michael Hamilton, who's a historian who's been writing for some years now, really focuses in on the role of Dwight Moody, which I mentioned in the story. And Moody is this figure, he's sort of the Billy Graham of his era. If you want to be anyone in sort of the evangelical world of the 1870s or 1880s, you're probably not too far from a connection to Dwight Moody and his institutions. And Moody himself was someone who had tendencies both in the Reformed direction, at least in certain of his theology, but then was also really attracted to the higher life and ended up becoming one of the major promoters of it. For the systematic theologian, it's quite frustrating to try to understand exactly where the consistency in his thinking was. But he wasn't a theologian. He was someone who deployed certain teachings in certain moments because he thought that's what would move people to, respond to the gospel message. And because of his prominence, that type of, you could say, unsystematic thinking just sort of became quite common among evangelicals. And that unsystematic thinking is one that has a lot of tendencies toward Wesleyan spirituality, even if some of the views on predestination or these other sort of theological questions that Calvinists are known for, biblical inerrancy is another one that's really a strong one within the Calvinist tradition. Those sort of can sit side by side for many, millions of lay evangelicals, even if the academics don't understand, sort of think those are contradictory. And that's part of the interest, for me, at least on the theological level of evangelicalism, is that that's sort of that's sort of the state of affairs most of the time, is you have these different sort of formal ways of thinking about the Christian tradition. And in the practice of it, it's something in the middle. And in the historiography and the way historians talk about this, I think there can be a tendency, particularly if the historians are ones that are bent toward intellectual history or bent toward studying the more systematic thinkers, to privilege those views when those are there, certainly, and they're important, but they're probably not representative of the mass of middle people who actually call themselves evangelicals, who are not systematic, who are very experience-oriented, and probably don't even understand a lot of the theology. They care much more about how to live as a Christian and less about the sort of abstract concepts that go into that.
I think one of my favorite descriptions of evangelicalism and kind of thinking about, is it more reformed? Is it more holiness? Is it more this or that? Was the kaleidoscope theory. And I think it was Timothy Smith. Who put that out there. And I remember reading that like a long time ago, early in my graduate studies, and being like, oh, that makes sense, because you can shift a kaleidoscope and it changes, what's neighboring each other shifts. And it depends on whether you're looking at it from the lens of theology. Are you looking at it from the lens of doctrine? Are you looking at it from the lens of institutions? Like the kaleidoscope shifts, and who is going to be really centralized in that picture is going to change. And I always thought that was, to me, the most effective image of what evangelicalism looks like.
I forgot about that article. There was another book in that same genre of varieties of American evangelicalism. I think it was, Dan, help me here, Robert Johnston. Does that ring a bell? It was edited by, which had a similar, drew on this. Just a quick story about what you were saying, Dan, about Moody and, how intellectual historians tend to gravitate towards the Calvinists. So when I was at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the early 1990s, I took a course with Thomas Nettles, who was a Southern Baptist historian who came up to the North and taught for a few years on 19th century evangelicalism. And the assignment was, you were assigned a figure and you had to, for the final exam, you had to speak as if you were that figure for like 10 minutes or something, and dialogue with the others. So the others were, Charles Hodge, Charles Finney, B.B. Warfield, some Southern Baptist figures. So I had Moody. I was just, it became hilarious because they're all debating predestination and inerrancy, and I'm just like, surrender your life to God and the world's going to hell. Here's the life, right? What was the famous line? Here's the life vest or the lifeboat, the what?
The life raft.
The life raft. Yeah. Get on it and be saved. And, afterwards I would chime in with this, and everyone would just, be like, you got the easy assignment, you don't have to really, and it was a fun, Nettles loved it. I got an A, but I said, hey, I'm trying to, I know this sounds like I didn't do my homework, but this was Moody, right?
And the Piersall Smiths were not options, I assume, for.
No, I don't remember them being, yeah.
Right. So thinking about the way that Piersall Smiths are situated in the 19th century, and also just thinking about the way that the holiness movement has other prominent figures, I'm thinking of Phoebe Palmer, that are female, right? Women play a really central role. And, setting aside the question of is that one of the reasons they've been decentered from the story, which is possible. Like historians have a tendency to not focus on women as much in past historiographies. How do you see gender as being really a central part of the holiness tradition writ large, or more specifically, the Piersall Smith story?
It's obviously central just from a how you tell the story or documentary way. You mentioned Phoebe Palmer, sort of one of the key holiness teachers of the middle of the 19th century. Hannah Piersall Smith's important. I've spent a lot of time researching Jessie Penn Lewis, who's a British Keswick speaker that comes just a little while after the Smiths. They're really important in part because they're supplying some of the core theology of at least the higher life. And what I mean by the higher life is it's a particular working out of the holiness movement, which is a very broad movement that includes all types of new denominations and traditions. The higher life becomes the version that becomes quite popular among the Moody circles. And just the content of the higher life is really indebted to Hannah Smith's 1875 book, The Christian Secret to a Happy Life, among other documents. So they're just important in telling the story. I think there's an interesting way where, these are women who would not don't have the opportunity to be ordained pastors and teachers because there's a norm, and in many denominations, just a rule against women having those roles. And they're working in these what we call parachurch or just non-ecclesial settings where those rules don't apply, and it's much more, you could say, a free market of charisma is what is getting you a hearing or not. And these are very charismatic people, and so they find ways to basically play the role. In some cases, you could argue, are playing more of a significant role than a local pastor for some people through their teaching and then through the writing that they're doing. I'll say, as a historian, sort of an intellectual historian who prizes texts as the way I engage. I mean, one of the key things about these particular women, and there were many other women that we could talk about that are probably maybe just as important, but they didn't leave behind as much of a written record. Even if they spoke a lot, were those taken down? Were they compiled in some way that would be accessible today? And so we do privilege, certainly intellectual historians do, privilege historical figures who have a lot of words attached to their name. And that tends to be men. Certainly in the 19th century, it does. I think the question you have to ask is, when women do appear in the historical record that have a lot of words attached to them, are they representing a broader trend that we're just not seeing, or were they truly unique people? I would say the ones we're talking about were unique in the sense that they amassed a lot of followers, sold a lot of books, and became charismatic figures themselves. But that's one of the conclusions I'm coming to as I'm working through this, is I think it's actually really hard to tell the central story of American evangelicalism without mentioning these figures in a way that most, up to now at least, most traditional histories of American evangelicalism have been able to sort of jump between major male pastors and major theologians, who tend to mostly be male as well, as sort of encompassing the tradition. I think these figures, if we're looking sort of at the spirituality and including that into the broader story, make a case that they're just as important to actually understand evangelical experience and practice during this period and after.
How, Dan, then would you connect your work to, say, a certain kind of historiography that's in vogue right now that would suggest that evangelicals, patriarchy, for example, is a telling sign or telling a piece of the identity of evangelicals? If you're doing it from a reformed, the reformed historians we mentioned before were interested in very educated Calvinists, right? But if you center the people you're centering, does that then challenge the prevailing notion of, evangelicals being, there's really two things going on here, right? Because one is the argument by Kristen Dumais and others that evangelicalism is a sort of patriarchal form of religion. And then there's also, I hear you saying, a lot of historians are not talking about women at the center of evangelicalism. Dumais seems to take it in a negative way, right? There's no women, so it must be patriarchal, or it is there's also a positive argument for patriarchy in her work as well. But you're suggesting these women are central changes the narrative, which might, I don't know, does that weaken the argument about patriarchy?
I see what you're saying.
You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
I wouldn't want to underplay gender dynamics of the late 19th century for any women. It's still a patriarchal world, but I think these a lot of it's into the details of the subcultures, and that's where it actually matters a bit about the Reformed and Wesleyan sides. Like the Wesleyan holiness movement, there was an emphasis on, to go back to spiritual power, and that spiritual power wasn't gender coded. It manifested in women just as much as men. You can see this emerge also in Pentecostalism in the early 20th century, which is very closely tied to the holiness movement, where, in Joel 2, it's the daughters and sons will prophesy type view, like women and men will be manifesting the gifts of the Spirit. And the holiness movement tended to take that more seriously than you could say other other Protestants did at the time. And so there was an ability for women who were claiming gifts or were charismatic to vie for a space in the public square. They had sort of the theological tools to make the case for that. That if you just focus on other parts of Protestantism, that's just not there. That They don't have the same view of the Holy Spirit and how the Holy Spirit falls on different people. So they're still operating within a patriarchal system in the sense that there are very strong norms against women pastors in particular, but there is a little more movement or ability to maneuver. And one other thing I'll say, there's another book by Donald Dayton that goes all the way, it's an earlier book from the 70s. And I'm going to forget the name, and maybe one of you can help me. Something about evangelical heritage.
Was it the discovery of an evangelical heritage?
The discovery or rediscovery. I don't remember what the term is. And he's making an argument there that, in line with what we've been talking about, that the sort of true history of evangelicalism is this reform, sort of radical, egalitarian tradition that goes all the way back to the abolitionists. And that's he's got an agenda that he's pushing with that. So you could quibble with. It's a short book too, so he's making sweeping claims and then moving on. But one of the things he points out is that in the 19th century, there was just a lot of different politics around women leading in religious spaces than in the early 20th century, when you have fundamentalism and sort of, you could say, a conservatism fall. And we tend to, after that period, normalize the early 20th century and say, sort of, that's the departure point. And he wanted to say, actually, if you go back to the 19th century, it's actually a little more messy. And I've done a little research on denominations like the Evangelical Free Church, which had its origins in the Danish Free Church and the Norwegian Free Church, which were around in the 19th century. And it's true that there were itinerant women preachers in those settings that by the 1920s would have never been allowed. So I don't want to overstate that, but just to say that this isn't just a linear story of the further back you go, more patriarchy, and the further closer you go, there's less. It's just really complicated, and it has a lot to do with theology, but also with immigration and norms in different parts of the country based on where immigrants are coming from. That means it's a complicated story when we think about how would we summarize all that into a general assessment.
But there is a sense, Dan, in which your work, your evidence that you're uncovering, suggests that in a largely 19th century patriarchal society, generally, not just even Christianity, but generally, evangelicals are actually kind of progressive on gender issues. They're doing things in their denominations and in their public spaces that a lot of people aren't doing in this patriarchal society, right? I mean, it's countercultural. I don't know ways.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I don't know if
would you go that far? Yeah.
I don't know if I'd go as far as say progressive. I think one thing, this is how I would think about some of that, is that women evangelicals are able to participate in, say, commercial culture and celebrity culture that allow them some agency, at least a few of them, some agency that we might look at as progressive, because we see progressive being more of that equals progress in sort of the status of women in society. But what it might actually be is just that evangelicalism is much more attuned to commercial and sort of consumer forces that mean that people in that world have a easier way of accessing those things. I don't know if they would have ever thought about it as progressive
or even probably maybe Maggie can help on this too. Feminist. It really wasn't that, but you have to consider what was available at the time, and they were doing things, they were making available roles for women that the larger culture and certainly larger Christianity was not. I don't know if that's a fair way to sort of get the nuance
here.
Well,
it's interesting that Hannah Piersall Smith is coming from Quaker, a Quaker background, right? Which is definitely more radically egalitarian than any of the other groups affiliated with evangelicalism. And Quakers stand outside of that fold. But adjacent enough when it comes to the holiness movement that she was able to kind of move back and forth, really, right? Because she returns to Quakerism after the scandal,
that's right?
And another thing, too, I don't know this period as well, but it does seem to me that the women that are mentioned are almost always coupled with husbands, right? So Hannah is coupled with her husband. Phoebe Palmer was talked about with her husband, Walter, I think was his name. And we can now see who was the real mind behind it, but that was a necessary component of their ministry, I think. And I don't know of any that stand apart from that. And another thing, too, and this is something Margaret Bendroth talks in her Gender and Fundamentalism book, which is an older book, but I think a really good one, is that you also have this shift in the 19th century. There's this belief that women are morally superior, which actually further ingrained the patriarchal system of women should stay in the home and not the public sphere and things like that, but enabled them to have some kind of moral authority in certain reform movements and perhaps in the holiness movement. I'm not aware of that. But when it comes to fundamentalism and this kind of shift that happens in the 1920s that Dan, you're bringing up with women in ministry, women are seen as equally sinful, if not more sinful. And the kind of story of the woman as the seductress and things like that becomes so much more a part of the discussion of women in the public sphere. And so you have that theological shift in evangelicalism as well that kind of comes with that crystallization of the fundamentalist modernist split. And we could talk about that in future episodes. But I do see those also as components of what's going on here that would sort of limit a progressive view of what's going on with women in the holiness movement.
Yeah, I just threw progressive out, as just to try to suggest that there was some pushback, I guess. Probably progressive is not the right word. There was some pushback against the traditional, whatever that looks like in the this is the historian in me, right? Whatever that looks like in the 19th century context, it was still pushback.
And I think the Second Great Awakening is also good evidence of that, right? There you do have more, and we can just see, zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, women were way more involved. The Second Great Awakening, there's an individualism there. You do have at least a couple of ordained women coming out of the Methodist movement.
It's also really interesting, sort of the way you think about history. And this is a big, big question, but Dan's mentioning of how it's all messy, right? It's hard to really nail down. You have this kind of Whiggish view of the way history is moving, where it's just getting better and better and better and better and better and better for, say, women, right? I think Laura Ulrich in her book, Good Wives, makes the case that women had more agency in 17th century New England than in the separate spheres era of the early 19th century. And women may have had more of a role to play in our case in 19th century evangelicalism than they did in post-fundamentalist evangelicalism. So it's, you're always trying to teach students about the way history moves. Is it cyclical? Is it a straight line or whatever? And it's a messy line, right, in this sense. So maybe you're going back to the 19th century and then you have to still explain that things change in post-fundamentalist evangelicalism, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, and there's a way that it's also about what we just assume progress looks like. Meg, I think you're right on that. A lot of these women who did achieve levels of leadership were tied to their husbands. Jessie Penn Lewis, who I mentioned before, she also was married. I honestly can't remember his name, so maybe that's a win for her or something in this moment. But I remember that was actually a part of her public ministry, was sort of showing she was part of a healthy marriage. There's an exception to that, which actually come out of the Keswick movement as well, which are women missionaries who tended to be single for life, sort of a version of an evangelical version of a nun or something like that, wedded to the church or wedded to the gospel. And so here you have people maybe less well known, but certainly has her fans, Lilias Trotter, who ultimately wrote the hymn that's "Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus." One way she's known now, or Amy Carmichael, who was a very significant devotional writer. We talk a lot about Oswald Chambers, the writer of My Utmost to His Highest, which is a very famous devotional. Chambers died early. His wife, Biddy Chambers, was actually the one that produced most of his writings, or at least edited them. So she was a widow, but still a missionary for her whole life. So anyway, but that's a norm. That's a norm of womanhood, this sort of
Mhm.
single woman who's off in a foreign country serving a population that is just not part of the progress narrative of womanhood in the 20th century American
Yeah.
context. And so it sort of is exceptional or put off to the side. But that was another way that in the 19th century, at least, women did play a significant role. They were often creating these mission organizations, doing most of the fundraising, actually building. Someone like Trotter built dozens of missionary outposts in Algeria and so forth, and managed hundreds of people. But it was in a way that's sort of off main stage of what we talk about when we talk about evangelicalism.
Yeah. And it's such a good point.
So I think there's a certain kind of person in, whether it be the American media or, critics of evangelicals, who like to talk about evangelicalism and scandal. And there's plenty of examples, right, of this, especially in the world of televangelism and so forth. We have a scandal in your story. I don't know. Is there something about evangelicalism that is more susceptible to scandal because they set such a high moral bar for themselves and speak publicly about themselves being exemplars, moral exemplars? Why so many scandals in evangelicalism? Is that part of how we should be thinking about the movement? Is it more open to this than, say, other forms of religion? If you look at contemporary, religion right now, certainly not. You see similar things in the Catholic Church. How does this whole scandal kind of play into the larger story that we're trying to define, evangelicalism here in these first 3 episodes?
Yeah, well, I really want to hear what both of you think, because I don't know if I have a ton of deep insight onto this, but I do think of the religion scholar Robert Orsi. I heard him give a talk on the Catholic sex abuse crisis, which he's done a lot of really sort of painstaking work in reconstructing particular episodes in that. And he had a line where he said something like, scandal is ridden through, like all religion has scandal, but every religious tradition has their own type of scandal. And it's conducive to the theology and the structure, institutional structure. And so the Catholic abuse crisis couldn't have happened the way it did in Baptist churches. It had to have the certain structure of the priests and how you moved around the priests and all that. And there's another sort of famous, infamous scandal of an Anabaptist theologian named John Howard Yoder, very well respected during his life. And I don't remember if it was right before he died or right after, but it came out that he was systematically abusing women under his care. But he had a particular theology that he would use to justify that and to keep people quiet. That was very conducive to his Anabaptist. It was a theology of love, sort of perverted theology of love type thing. And that type of way of having a scandal would not have worked in a Presbyterian setting. So that's all to say, like, every subculture has their own way of having a scandal. The thing that I was just noted about Robert Piersall Smith is there's this celebrity part that we've already talked about as being part of evangelicalism. And then there's the itinerancy part. I mean, it's not an accident, I don't think, that the scandal happens when he's traveling in Europe. And it's such a weird scandal. I mean, as far as I understand, there's still not clarity, however many decades we're here after, on exactly what happened, and there probably never will be, because there's not like the evidence to actually definitively come down on that. But it happened in a traveling, a hotel or similar type setting where there was not a lot of structure and, you could say, oversight of someone like Smith. And so that seems to me to be part of the evangelical culture as well, is like, this is how celebrity functions. You end up traveling a lot. You end up having situations where you're able to do things in private if you so choose. And there aren't the same institutional checks, you could say, that might be there in other religious traditions. So those are the things that came to mind when I was thinking about, like, oh yeah, those seem like things that we could still see today in a lot of the scandals. But I'm curious if you think of other things that sort of would make the phenomenon of scandal that seems to be so prevalent in evangelicalism like something that is that common.
I mean, I think, just kind of going off of what you're saying, Dan, I think that does kind of bolster the argument for the patriarchy of evangelicalism, because one thing that most evangelical scandals have in common are men behaving badly, and that kind of cult of personality around really charismatic men, and their downfalls usually being some kind of sexual vice. Not always, but usually. So I think that there's an interesting thing that could be talked about there. I think in just my work and kind of what I see, because I research divorce, that's kind of inherently a bit of a scandal, and discussions of it often are centered around scandal. But one thing that I've noticed in 20th century evangelicalism is that there is a very conscious, intentional, we must protect the gospel from scandal mentality in evangelicalism. And that you see it manifest itself in like why people will distance themselves from certain things, even if they kind of question whether or not something is a gray area or actually wrong. So you can see kind of some lack of justice there. But you can also see it in the way that there's self-policing, particularly in the conservative evangelical and fundamentalist movement, that this idea that we're going to make sure that no one drags us down with them. We're not going down with the ship kind of thing. So we're going to cut you off if you make this choice or that. Although at the same kind of level as that, you can see sometimes where people protect their underlings from scandal in order to kind of protect the broader ministry. So like you get this kind of like self-protectionism from it as well. So, I mean, that's not a easy answer in the sense that I think in every institution you're going to have problems. You're going to have people that are not doing things well, and reactions to that are complicated by theology. Right. So you do have the misuse of sort of like, we're supposed to be a forgiving people. And then does that mean a return to power or not? That's a huge debate right now. I've seen that all over Substack talking about the Philip Yancey recent scandal. But you also have the sort of utilitarian, if we get rid of this person, and I'm thinking of, I forget his name, but Carl McIntyre's, one of his underlings who was often tied with, it was rumors of homosexuality. Am I remembering that?
Billy James Hargis.
Yeah. And there's another one too. I don't think it was just Hargis. I think there was someone else. But anyway, McIntyre was seen as protecting him. And on one hand, it was because he's like, we're supposed to forgive. He's confessed, like all these sorts of things. But there's also a utilitarian, like he needed the work of this man in his ministry. So it's a complicated thing. I don't have like an easy, I think that this is central. But I do think that the way that evangelicalism centers around cults of personality or media empires, particularly in the 20th century, like as a parachurch thing, like singular individuals will build their media empires. We'll talk about that more in the next episode. And with that comes a sort of elevation of that personality to they can do no wrong. And then when they fall hard.
Clearly, there's something within evangelicalism, whether it be the high moral standards that they place upon themselves, that makes them an sort of self-protective or makes them not, they know scandal is real. Like they feel it, I'm thinking like the Billy Graham rule, right? Mm-hmm. Or he's always traveling, right? Keep the door ajar, these kinds of things. So there's whether or not the scandals occur or not, the actual scandal is always on the mind of evangelicals. And I think it's largely too, if you think about the 19th century as a kind of, a century, an evangelical century, right? We could debate that. They're at the front of they're front of public life, right? The reform movements and, it's largely an evangelical culture. It was definitely before the Civil War. I think we talked about this last time. You have this kind of period of quietism, where evangelicals aren't saying much in the 20th century after the Scopes trial. But then you have, the 70s and 80s. Suddenly now they're the moral majority and so forth, and they set such a high bar. They preach at people. And so whenever you preach at people, the scandals become that much greater when you fall or contradict what you're telling everyone else to do. I think you see some of that in the 19th century too. I don't know if I call Henry Ward Beecher an evangelical, but his scandal, right? And Amy Semple McPherson, these kinds of people, which is really when you said it was mostly men. I agree with you, Maggie. The one woman I could think of was Amy Semple McPherson. I'm sure there's others. So I think this is part of the story. I'm not sure it rises to the level of a point in the, an additional point we want to add to the Ebbington Quadrilateral, but it's certainly in the mix, right? And it becomes more, these scandals become more, I don't know if I want to use celebrated, but more publicized simply because of the nature of the way evangelicals tend to approach public life as kind of the wagging their finger at everybody else. That may have something to do with it as well.
And if they're on the, maybe it's a little side to scandal, but on the role of sex in scandal, it's also just, I think, important to remember that if we zoom out to the holiness movement, there's a lot of experimentation with free love, and I think of the Oneida community and other things that are happening. We tend to segment those out of evangelicalism because of the theology and other things. But, at the time, these were all coming out of the same sort of revivalist Wesleyan sort of stew. And so there is also part of evangelicalism that is experimenting with gender roles and rethinking marriage. I mean, that's part of, at least for some evangelicals, part of the appeal is that you get to rethink tradition very, very broadly. And, we talked about this last time, sort of interpret the Bible in your own way and sort of follow that way. And so I mentioned in the story that this sort of doctrine of holy kisses as sort of this somewhat prevalent teaching that was scandalous, certainly for culture, society, but was also really popular. Where, as the quote I had from the Smith's son, sort of the amorous and the spiritual are like right next to each other, sort of in terms of the emotions they tap into, the energy it taps into. And so that's actually part of the appeal for a lot of evangelicals, at least some. And you could put the Robert Piersall Smith in that camp. That's part of evangelicalism as well. It's not the part that tends to be the finger wagging part, but often it's part of the experience of evangelicalism. It might be the scandal part, but it's still a consistent part.
A lot of it hasn't really been explored. Like, who knows what's going on in these like communal evangelical, we've seen some examples of this where we find out that Lonnie Frisbee was gay, in the Jesus People movement, but we just don't know, it's camp meetings, right? I mean, you get a bunch of men and women camping out for a week, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess I have a robust enough view of sin that I was suggesting stuff might happen. There's a sense in which this kind of loving of your brothers and sisters, this kind of not free love, but the holy kiss, right? I mean, I just don't think we know a whole lot about it, except for the big people that get into trouble, right?
And I mean, there definitely are, as Dan pointed out, these groups that take that and run with it. Like sometimes it goes the other direction and you get experiments into celibacy, right? And those groups don't last very long.
That's right.
Not shocking, or perhaps shocking to some people, I don't know. Yeah, you have a lot of experimentation with like, what is marriage? What ought it to be if we are truly changed by the Spirit? And so that's going to be
or spiritual friendship with the opposite sex, right? That's such an evangelical thing. Like we're brothers and sisters in Christ. We're hanging out. So there's a lot of stuff that's I'm probably giving some historian listening to this some idea for the next crazy book that's going to attack.
That everyone's going to get really upset about.
Undermine evangelicalism.
And just to bring it up to the present, maybe we can move on after that. But we will talk about things later on in the series about like purity culture in the in the 1990s and 2000s. That comes from a history. Like that's not just suddenly a sort of panic that happened because of the 60s, even, which is often how a lot of that is framed. It's like this is an ongoing theme that goes back, really as far as evangelicalism goes back, about monitoring the relationship between men and women. What is marriage? What is appropriate inside and outside of marriage? Yeah, these are not just things that happened in the past or things that are from the 90s or 2000s. It's the whole span.
And I think too, just again with that variety of American evangelicalism, just the fact that there are so many different ways of arranging authority and hierarchy also just leaves some people open to scandal in ways that just don't exist. I'm thinking of Tim Keller made a comment on the Mars Hill podcast that was done a few years ago. And I just remember them like talking about it. And he goes, well, this could never happen in the Presbyterian church. He was just like pointing out that like, I see how you're like making a correlation, but that could never happen because I am always under the authority of others because of the hierarchy within my denomination. And so it's interesting too, the way that the variety of denominations within evangelicalism can really change what is even possible or what's checked and what isn't.
But back to Dan's work, if you center these holiness people where evangelicalism is a spiritual passion, they're feeling a common sympathy with one another in the spirit kind of thing, as opposed to like the Reformed, right? Where they're debating theology, and there's no really emotion, right? It's right belief. This kind of sexual stuff might play more of a role in the story, right?
Sure.
Although I'm sure, there's certainly examples of, austere Calvinist dons or whatever, probably doing these things too.
Right.
I don't know, there just seems to be something about the holiness model that opens this more up.
So Dan, I'm curious in that you're talking about your work and what you're exploring right now. How are you looking for the holiness movement and just kind of the impact of particularly self-help? That's the one that I find very interesting. Like, what do you look for in being like, there it is?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question because we're talking about things that aren't systematic. And so it's sort of how would you track any sort of pop culture phenomenon? It's sort of like memes and reference points. I think what I'm interested in is there's a particular style of holiness that becomes very popular among evangelicals. And it is a lot about self-surrender or words to that effect. That is what needs to happen on the inside of the Christian. And that this self-surrender will paradoxically lead to empowerment through the Holy Spirit. Some people take that really in a certain direction and are Pentecostal about it and say, actually, you will manifest spiritual gifts. Others will say you will enter a state of happiness, of joy that you couldn't imagine, except that you've surrendered your life to Christ. And then what are you to do with that? Whether it's spiritual gifts or happiness or peace. And there's all types of suggestions by evangelicals about what you should do with that. Some people really point toward a life of piety and holiness is really the thing you should strive for. Others point to a service. You should be an evangelist, or you should help the poor. That's the evangelical conversation. What's interesting to me is how similar that conversation is and how there's actually influences that go back and forth with what we'd call just sort of secular self-help work. That is probably the thing that Americans just consume the most of anything, which is how do I live a better life? You have the subtopics of how do I lose weight, or how do I look better, or how do I do more with the time I have? But then you have sort of more general, sort of just how can I be happier? How can I make a difference in the world? All that kind of stuff. I see those conversations as, in part, indebted to a secularized version of what evangelicals have cared about for a long time. It's not the only thing. And the other sort of big tradition that is really the main tradition that self-help comes out of is the positive thought movement of the 19th century. Sometimes this is called metaphysical religion. The historian that's done so much on this is Catherine Albanese. She's written multiple books on this. But it sort of starts with like the transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you read Emerson, it's a very sort of, it's a lot of aphorisms, like if you do this, then this will happen type things. And it's very much about summoning the strength within you to be a better person and to actually deify yourself, you could say, to become everything that Christians say God is. And this works its way through the 19th and 20th century into the main ways we think about, getting rich, getting healthy, sort of important books like How to Win Friends and Influence People. You can think of the positive thoughts of sort of the Oprah style of spirituality. That's different than evangelicalism, obviously, but what's interesting to me is just how much overlap there is in someone like Billy Graham, who trafficked in both of these in certain moments, or someone that we don't really call an evangelical, though he hung out with a lot of evangelicals, someone like Norman Vincent Peale, or Robert Scholler, the pastor of the Crystal Cathedral, which was a big deal in the 80s and 90s in particular. These are people that, depending on who's talking, get counted as evangelicals. But if you look at their work, they're actually like as indebted to these sort of positive thought, mind cure type traditions as they are to strict reform theology or something like that. And that gets back to where we started, which is evangelicalism interesting in part because those things blend in ways that really no one has the gatekeeping capacity to stop them from blending, particularly in the popular conversation. And so what most evangelicals sort of experience on the ground is a mix of those things. And I think this is particularly true in devotionals. If you just go through like the history of the devotionals that sell tens of millions of copies, you see both of these types of evangelical spirituality and positive thought alongside each other mixed together. You see it in other places as well, televangelism and so forth. But that to me is the interesting story that, for historians at least, of evangelicalism, we haven't focused enough on positive thought as like an actual vibrant tradition that evangelicalism is engaging with. we haven't appreciated that. But it seems to me that when we talk about particularly American evangelicals, how do they think about spirituality? You have to talk about Oprah, at least for the last few decades. And going back, you have to talk about people like Dale Carnegie, in part because the sources show it. They show that there's this actual borrowing, but also you can just see how the ideas from one make their way over into the other pretty seamlessly.
Yeah, and I've been saying this through this whole episode, but it's when historians study American evangelicalism, there is this natural propensity, American evangelicalism, right? There's this natural propensity to kind of, how is evangelicalism being shaped by the larger culture or by intellectual trends or something that may or may not map on very well with Christianity. So, the old historiography, now old, like Marsden Noll and these guys, they were always talking, because they were focusing on the Calvinists, they were always talking about the way in which evangelicalism was related to these more rational intellectual ideas, right? That was the part of American culture, common sense realism and rational things. And this is how they got inerrancy, right? They embraced Baconianism and this kind of stuff. But what you're trying to suggest, Dan, I think, is that if you focus on the holiness people and put them central, then there's a different set of kind of American ideas or a different American culture that evangelicalism engaging with. That's, I think, a new contribution in this. I mean, everyone knows about it in like the present. There's people who write about consumerism and all that, but to historicize that, I think, is a contribution.
So, in your work, do you see this as kind of fitting in with the argument that David Bebbington has made that along with like common sense realism and the impact of the Enlightenment on evangelicalism, there's also the impact of Romanticism from the early 19th century?
Yeah, I really indebted to Bebbington for that. And it gets into the larger Victorian sort of culture that Anglo-American evangelicalism is stewing in the late 19th century. The way I see that paying out later on, I mean, you could say there's a romantic, even mystical sort of strand of evangelicalism. I think if you listen to a lot of contemporary worship music, it's bordering on the mystical in the way that the spirit is communing with the individual person. But I also think there's this larger arc over the 20th century in American culture of the therapeutic, and it's something that has resonances with the Romantic in the 19th century, and that's something I'm interested in too, is how the Romantic and the therapeutic and these certain ways of thinking about the individual's relationship to society and the centering of the individual subjective experience are really a core of what evangelicals care about and what they write a lot about and spend a lot of time having sermons about. And it's I don't know if Romanticism was the first place you could find that, because I think you go back and you could also say there's something about the mystical tradition that, even though we tend to separate that entirely from evangelicalism, actually has some impact on it. But certainly by the 19th century, the major sort of influences are Romanticism, and even the Keswick Convention is in Keswick, England, which is in what's called the Lake District, which is where a number of Romantic poets in British culture, Wordsworth and others, sort of emerged. It's not exactly as clean as they picked that place because they wanted to, sort of acknowledge the Romantic influences. But there was even something about the Keswick Convention. There was an appeal to say, let's get into nature. Let's sort of get away from civilization. Let's have these encounters with the divine that are very romantic. It's not hard to connect the dots there. And it was also this sort of, you got to commune with these great poets, you didn't commune with them, but with their area. That was very appealing to, in the 1870s, 1880s, to certain American evangelicals who wanted to make that trip. So even in the location of the Keswick Convention, you have that sort of ode to the Romantic influence.
I think this is so interesting, and it's something I see looking around the kind of church, that people are very interested in the connections between kind of historic evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, and then before that, the holiness movement, because they are now, in our day and age, very much so seen as part and parcel of the same thing. But historically speaking, not so much. And you have historians that are kind of pushing back against that. I've been making my way through, it's Douglas Weaver's book, Baptist and the Holy Spirit, right? Have you read that at all? It's giant.
Yeah, it's huge.
It's a huge book. It's just interesting, right? Because he talks about Bapticostals. Right, and I was like, that's just a word I want to use a lot. But also is an interesting trend that I've seen personally but I can't say that I've seen it in the historical work. So I do think that there's a lot that's really rich for scholarship and exploration in what you're doing. And I think it's going to be really very interesting. So
yeah, just to list one more historian, there's a really good book from a few years ago by Neil J. Young, not to be confused with the singer, called We Gather Together. And I don't remember the subtitle, but it was about these subgroups within evangelicalism, particularly charismatics and called cessationists or whatever, sort of Baptists who don't believe in the gifts are, and then Catholics, and how they had to really mediate these doctrinal differences in order to create a unified political front in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. And it's just sort of surprising how much of their discussion at that time was not actually about politics, which they all agreed they're more conservative. It was actually like, can I as a Baptist work with you as an Assemblies of God person? And I think today we take for granted, like, that's not as important as these political issues, but that's a historical development.
They worked it
that out. In the 70s and 80s was just on the forefront. It was actually they actually were the ones who had to create that mentality that says, actually, it's more important to unify with people who are different from you denominationally, but share the same view on abortion or these other cultural issues. Robert Wuthnow, the sociologist, calls this the restructuring of American religion from a denominational one to one that's basically a traditionalist versus progressive sort of spectrum. And again, we're on the other side of that, so we just assume this is how religion has been. Like you'd sort of naturally be more interested, if you're a Methodist, a conservative Methodist, you'd be more interested in working with a conservative Presbyterian than a liberal Methodist. But that's very new thinking, and that gets at some of these deeper theological differences that if you're not careful, you won't realize how new the situation we're in is versus 100 years ago or when these Pentecostals and when it emerged, how disruptive it was to the whole scene.
Lots for us to talk about in future episodes then.
So in this episode, we've explored what happens after evangelical conversion, the ongoing spiritual life that the Bebbington Quadrilateral doesn't fully capture. At least that's what we contended. I introduced us to Robert and Hannah Piersall Smith. They were a 19th century evangelical couple who became transatlantic celebrities in the 1870s through promoting a type of higher life holiness that was also embodied in the Keswick movement in Great Britain. And this type of holiness was more indebted to Wesleyan theology from John Wesley and the Wesleyan inflected vision of Christian empowerment through the Holy Spirit than previous ways of Christian living in America that were more on the Reformed side. And we also talked about how that holiness tradition that was rooted more in Wesley than in Calvin shaped and informed an experiential individualist evangelicalism that would, for some, later blur into the modern self-help culture that is so dominant in America. And we also probed the role of women in the movement with Hannah Piersall Smith as a key case study. She was a female teacher with public authority, but also one whose platform was tied to her husband's reputation, and when he ultimately had a scandal that also ended her ministry as well.
In the next episode of American Evangelicals, a History Podcast, the focus turns to one of the most contentious, widely discussed, and often misunderstood chapters in American evangelical history: fundamentalism. The story begins with a minister named Donald Gray Barnhouse, who built a coast-to-coast radio ministry and late in life made a striking resolution to stop fighting everyone he disagreed with. What followed sheds light on why fundamentalism was never quite as simple as it appeared. The episode explores the origins of the term fundamentalism, tracing its roots as a largely northern, urban movement and examining how it fractured, not primarily over conflicts with modernists, but through intense internal disputes. Along the way, the conversation unpacks key theological fault lines, including dispensationalism, premillennialism, and separatism, and considers how their influence continues to echo today. Thanks for listening to American Evangelicals, a History Podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if this episode sparked your curiosity, consider sharing it with someone who wants a deeper, more nuanced understanding of evangelical history. Until next time, thanks for listening.